So one of the topics that you will definitely see on your exam is firewalls. Typically, we see them implemented in a bunch of different ways, but hardware, firmware, and software are usually the big three. You think about Windows firewall, that's software, right? Some of the hardware that you see out there, like a WatchGuard, we'll get into intrusion detection here, but like a WatchGuard firewall or a Juniper firewall or an ASA for Cisco, you usually see those are the big three in the marketplace. But what can you do with a firewall? Well, it works really as a proxy. And what does that mean? Well, that means that it's the middleman. It sits in between one network segment and another network segment. It doesn't necessarily have to be outside the network to inside the network. You can put a firewall anywhere. But typically the most popular place that people usually think that they belong is external, outside of the corporate network, and making sure that no bad guys get in from there. So usually what you'll see is a firewall and then the DMZ, demilitarized zone, and then another firewall to segment off the things that you want to be able to have people on the internet to be able to access, like your web server or maybe your SharePoint server. They have these things called dual homed that you may have heard of before, and basically that's two NICs, so two network interface cards, dual homed. Homed means that it just has multiple network interfaces on it, and what you can do is you can plug in different networks into the firewall, and through maybe a plane on the firewall, so something on the hardware, you can isolate those two networks so they don't have to talk. And typically that's done through some simple commands that keeps them separate. So number one way that in the DoD world that you could think about it would be if you wanted to separate a nipper from SIPper, you could actually put them on the same piece of hardware, but if you did not tell those two ports to logically talk to each other, they would not logically talk to each other. So they're physically isolated by two network cables, and then logically isolated because if you don't tell it to talk, they won't talk to each other. And if you look at it from a perspective of where it operates here, it actually would be what we were talking about earlier, sort of a hybrid. It can operate anywhere. It can look at MAC addresses, it can look at IP addresses, it can look at routes on the network, and you can lock it down any way you want. By default, it's recommended that you deny all. So you practice what's called the principle of least access. So deny all. So right off the get-go, you might have some connectivity issues, but then you start building out the connectivity after that. Instead of just saying carte blanche across the board, let's go ahead and allow everybody and their grandma to connect. We're going to deny access, and then as needed, we'll open it up. And that's a great practice. So two terms here that kind of stick out to me, or actually, we'll talk about three of them. We talked a little bit about the proxy, and that's the middleman, right? You think about a proxy, I think about the teller at the bank. If you go through the drive-through at the bank, that's the person between you and the vault, the money, right? And because of that, they work as a proxy. So that is what I think of between the application proxy or a firewall when you're describing it. It's basically going to be looking at everything that comes through the network. These two other terms here that are pretty good are stateful packet inspection and then network address translation. We talked a little bit earlier about the access control list, but really for purposes of your test, access control list will be probably the one that's associated most often than not with firewalls. So keep that in mind as you're going through and studying.